The House settlement is finalized, and schools will finally, above the table, be able to directly pay their players.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Monday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton, and back from his vacation is Isaac Shade over there. You are listening to the place to get your college basketball content every single day, Monday through Friday, even in the off season, even from vacation. We are getting you these shows every single day. I want to thank all of you for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you that you can check out the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And of course, give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord community. Today's episode is brought to you all by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first bet of $5 or more wins. Isaac, big news. It was a Friday night news dump that we got with the House versus NCAA settlement being officially approved, finalized on Friday. Boy, there is so much about this to unpack behind the scenes. We thought about doing just 2/3 of the show on this and doing something else for the final segment. And we were like, nah, we got probably more than 30 minutes worth of content.
It's still not enough. Yeah, exactly.
We're going to be talking about this for weeks, probably on this show, as there's just so much to unpack. And frankly, Isaac, so much that we don't know still. And I think that's an interesting part of this conversation too, is how much we learned from the settlement and what we're going to see. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about roster limits, which is a big part of this, NIL ramifications, paying players directly. That's obviously the big storyline here. But yeah, like we said, we're going to get to some more of this in future episodes as we kind of get more into what all of this means, this massive seismic permanent change in college athletics as the House settlement was finalized on Friday, June 6th by U.S. District Judge Claudia Wilkin. And Isaac, why don't you give us a little bit more context here, and then we're going to start breaking this thing down piece by piece.
Yeah, first off, Andy, want to wish a happy anniversary to you and your beautiful bride, Miss Jenna. Gang Day, we're celebrating 6 wonderful years of marriage on Sunday, so make sure you give Andy a big shout out for that. And also, Andy, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is Judge Wilkins' last thing she's doing before she retires.
Yeah, I remember that too. She said Friday 9 p.m. That's good enough for me to get this thing out and go on with my weekend.
What a way to go. Anyway, man, yeah, so here's a few context things. First off, Andy, just to clear the air on some stuff, I think a lot of people, when they hear the House settlement, they assume that it's something that is related to the NCAA versus the House of Representatives or the larger Congress. That's not true. Yeah. It's simply shorthand for House versus NCAA. The problem here is that House is actually in reference to a student athlete, a swimmer named Grant House. Yep. It's just very unfortunate naming and titling and all that. So Grant House was a former Arizona State swimmer who sued the NCAA and the 5 power conferences, ACC, Big 12, Big 10, yes, still the Pac-12 and the SEC, back in 2020, along with Sedona Price, a women's college basketball player. And they actually brought 3 separate settlements, 3 separate antitrust suits, I guess I should say, under this umbrella of House versus NCAA. And they're represented by Steve Berman and Jeffrey Kessler, who are 2 well-known antitrust lawyers. And so it's just been this ongoing thing, Andy, for a good while now. And finally, on Friday, it was settled. And Andy, as you said, it gives us a lot of answers, but I think it also, as answers often do, raises a lot more questions for us. So our goal here is to start unpacking what we have learned and found out, and also try to look ahead to the things we don't know. And Andy, I think a promise that you and I want to make to our listeners and viewers is we are reading and doing as much research as we can on this, so we can bring you the best knowledge and information that is available right now. We're not flying from the hip or shooting from the hip on this thing. We are trying to be as prepared and ready and researched as possible so that we can give you good information. So Andy, all of that said, what is probably the biggest result that we need to start with in unpacking this conversation?
Well, it's that schools can directly pay players. I mean, that simply fundamentally, that's the biggest, most obvious change that this settlement will start kind of creating. And as this is going to start on July 1st, at that point, schools will directly be able to pay players. And what we mean by that is that as opposed to going through NIL collectives and going through third-party NIL deals with like different companies, which those still exist, and we're going to talk a lot more about those later. Those are still a thing, and they're going to be more heavily policed than they were previously, but that is still a thing. But instead of that being the only way, now a university can directly pay a student athlete. That is a massive change. I mean, that is the end of amateurism. Like that is the official nail in the coffin for, and again, it's been dead or it's been altered. This is a significant step of like, this money is now coming directly from the programs, and all of the schools from the power conferences, the ACC, the Big 12, the Big 10, the SEC, and the Pac-12, notably on this list, they're participating. D1 schools from other conferences can choose to opt in, and they must formally do so by June 15th, which is this upcoming Sunday, literally less than a week from when we're listening to the show. So we're going to find out who else is opting into this that's not in the power conferences. A full list of those participating schools will be made public, so that is part of that. And again, another big part of this is the amount of money. And I think that's a big part of it too, that we don't know the final amount. We don't know the exact amount of money, but there will be a cap. There will be a cap on the amount of money that schools can directly pay student athletes. And that cap is based on it's basically based on an average of how much money the power conferences are reporting that they're making in revenue. The expectation is somewhere in the ballpark of $20.5 million. I saw a few other places that floated, it might be a little bit more than that, but somewhere around $20 million is how much money schools will be able to pay their student athletes. And I think a key part of this, and Isaac, I'm going to turn it over to you after I say this, is it does, like, the schools are not being given $20 million to then spend on like, you have to still have like it is that you can spend, and certainly many programs out there are going to very easily be able to spend $20 million per year. But even some Power 5 programs, and certainly non-Power 5 programs who opt in, like they may only spend $3 million or $5 million or 12 or whatever it may be, but you have a capped limit up to what we expect to be around $20 million, and that will increase by 4% every year, and it'll be reevaluated at least every couple of years. They're going to take a look at it.
Yeah, Andy, that's crazy. And the terms of this, by the way, this settlement are for 10 years. So then we'll see what happens after that. And Andy, what's kind of interesting to me is, you mentioned that opting in or opting out by next Sunday, June 15th. Interesting to me that schools, part of the verbiage is that schools can opt in or opt out on an annual basis, but they have to make this decision by March 1st of the prior year. So let's say we get to March or February, I don't know if it's a leap year, 27th or whatever, of 2026. If you want to opt out, like maybe you were opted in, you want to opt out for the 26-27 school year, you got to formally let the NCAA know by March 1st, like before March Madness starts. And that's pretty crazy, Andy. And so that's something to be aware of as well. Now, Andy, people hear that $20.5 million and they're like, but I've also heard $2.8 billion. What is that number? That number is all back payment back a decade to students who were participants from 2016 through 2024 that are going to receive, there's a breakdown of how that's going to be given out. 75% to football, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, and 5% to literally every other sport. And so you already see the haves and the have-nots there continuing to be differentiated, Andy. I said that word with weird emphasis on it. But so that's where that $2.8 billion number comes in, and what the difference is between that and that $20.5 million. I think that might have been confusing for some folks.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly as we get into some of the more NIL aspects of this. I think that specific framework for the back payment that you mentioned, 75% to football, 15% to men's, 5% to women's basketball, and then 5% for everybody else. Like, a lot of programs are kind of expected to utilize that formula for how they're going to allocate the money that they now have. So if like Kentucky has $20 million, like in theory, Kentucky's maybe a bad example, but like in theory, they would give 75% to football, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's, 5% to everybody else. They don't have to do that. And again, Mark Pope's probably going to say, no, we would like more than 15% of that. And we were talking offline about how that's going to be interesting at certain schools where it's like, oh, like, you know, SEC football is king, but what about the basketball programs in the SEC? What about the you know, like, it's going to be interesting to see how some of that shakes out. But again, Isaac, I think a key part of this is that this is not the end, like this 20 million or whatever it ends up being that all these schools have is not the only way for student athletes to make money. It's not taking away the current other NIL options that they have now.
And what's weird, Andy, is I think one of the more intriguing things is kind of what you were starting to get to there. I'm really curious to see how schools determine how they want to allocate that $20.5 million. Because I feel like this could be serious points of contention within athletic departments, right? Like, screw that. Why are they getting that much? We're performing so much better.
There's going to be clipboards thrown in staff meetings. There's going to be red faces. There's going to be people. It's going to get ugly.
Brick, you stabbed a guy in the heart with a trident.
Oh, man.
Like, Andy, seriously, like, this could be crazy, but I think it's going to be where the conversation we're going to get into next about NIL dollars really starts to come in, as well as how do we continue to balance all of that, man. It's just, it's going to be a whole new world, folks. And I think that's just something as we get ready to move on here that we got to be aware of is this is a groundbreaking day that could be seismically changing what we know of college athletics, hopefully for the better, but we'll ultimately see, Andy. And so let's keep moving on then, because student athletes, as Andy said, can still get paid via additional third-party NIL opportunities, but it's going to look a lot different going forward. Hopefully not the wild, wild west anymore. We'll get to that in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel, the NBA playoffs, or specifically the NBA finals, are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot, hello, Tyrese, or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action than right now. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game, both before tip-off and live in real time. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans like you have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Andy, right before we hopped on to record, game 2 went final. The Thunder weren't messing around this time. They played it, finished it off. Game 3 back in Indianapolis at Gamebridge on Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. Eastern. Thunder -4 on the road. By the way, pretty cool. If you're watching, Andy's got his Chet Holmgren and Mr. Nembhard jerseys up there behind him, as a good Locked On Zags host should do. If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up right now. Head on over to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets. So go ahead, make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Andy, we began our house settlement conversation by looking at the, hey, schools can directly pay players now side of it. But then it gets into, but what happens to NIL? Because I think the hope for a long time has been like, hey, that's great, we can pay players, but is it going to fix NIL? Because the NCAA drug its feet forever on getting going on paying players, and that's what led to the wild, wild west. So, Andy, here's the next big question we got to answer. If this works, and that's a massive if, is it going to level the playing field? Is it going to fix NIL? Is it going to rein this all in? What do you think?
Yeah, Charlie Baker thinks so.
Okay, good.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I guess. I'm not sure that it evens the playing field. Like not everybody's not operating at the same even level, but I don't know if that's necessarily the goal. Again, like, should Green Bay or some of those schools have the same ability to pay players as Kentucky? Like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think some people would say, yes, absolutely. Everybody should have a perfect hard cap and there should be no additional income, like how some professional sports operate. But like,
look, Doug Gottlieb is banging on your door right now because he's mad at you for that.
Right,
Green Bay take.
Professional sports leagues are like what, 30, 32 teams at max, something like that. Like you're talking about 360 D1 teams. Like it just cannot be even. But I do think that an element of this that'll be interesting is like, are we able to eliminate or significantly downplay the amount of kind of under the table payments that are happening, and like more so now, like just the complete chaos that's happening? I mean, I think like obviously none of the house settlement rules are regarding like multi-time transfers and various other things that are contributing to the chaos and the wild west of it all. And those are things that maybe eventually get addressed in some collective bargaining, which I do think is an upcoming step that we'll hear about. But at the end of the day, like every program having a maximum amount of money the school can spend is a form of a cap and a form of a way to limit the playing fields. But student athletes can still make money in additional ways. And Isaac, we do have a new governing body, which I don't know if this is what the people wanted, but it is something that we're getting, that is going to more police or more monitor the third-party NIL payments. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the rules and regulations around what's about to change with third-party NIL payments, I don't know. I read it. I read the articles. I read it directly on the website, and I'm not super confident that this is going to make a huge change. I'd love to hear your thoughts, though. First of all, if you could explain a little bit about what it is.
Let me do that. So the Power 5 conferences came together and said, we want to create a body to regulate this thing. And that's what they did. This is not like, that's a key point here. The College Sports Commission is what it's called, or CSC for short, is not created by the NCAA, Andy. I think people need to wrap their brains around that. And so the College Sports Commission has been created to oversee all this. A CEO was named for it. His name is Brian Seeley. He's formerly the MLB EVP of Legal and Operations. And within that, then, they commissioned, the power conferences did, the CSC, to create some sort of portal to help them regulate these third-party NIL deals. So they got assistance from a group called Deloitte, and they created what's called NIL Go. And NIL Go is basically to determine whether third-party NIL deals are made with the purpose of using a student athlete's NIL, name, image, and likeness, for a valid business purpose, and to not exceed a reasonable, quote, range of compensation. And that's directly from the CSC website, Andy. And as part of this, this is not separate. Whether schools opt into the rev share or not, they are also bound by this, Andy. I think that's a critical point of this. And basically, the groundwork here is deals of $600 or more. So if it's an NIL third-party deal under $600, it's good, and you don't have to send it through this thing. So, Andy, I can't wait to see all these $599.99 fire sales popping up everywhere. Like, hey, you want an NIL deal that doesn't have to go through NIL Go? We got a $599. Anyway, it's a whole thing, Andy. And this has already started, right? This does not wait until July 1st. Literally directly from the CSC website, this side of things, as of literally Saturday, this past Saturday, June 7th, if you sign an NIL third-party deal, it's got to go through NIL Go, Andy. So this is already in place.
I'm so fascinated. I'm so intrigued by how this is going to work. I think that the language that they use is very, it's weirdly specific and also incredibly vague. Like the people who wrote it were very intentional about getting across both those things, because
and why do you think that is?
I think for a couple of reasons. I think the main thing is that they wanted to make sure that this thing did not just get appealed to death, which was already kind of happening. And like the more specific language you use, the more likely it is to get picked apart by lawyers. And again, like billable hours always wins. And like the more time that people can spend reading over this thing, the longer it's going to take to get it done. But I do also think like they wanted to communicate like, hey, we want to make sure that NIL payments are actually being made to student athletes based on their name, image, likeness. Like they're really stuck on like, we don't want pay for play. We want this to be a name, image, likeness type deal. But they also they don't want to put a bunch of super strict parameters around it. I mean, that $600 is a pretty vague amount of money, but at least it's like a baseline. But like to say like, oh, it's exceed a reasonable range of compensation. What does that mean? Like this is the example I was using earlier, like the Tyron Stokes, the number one recruit in the 2026 class. Like he's on a visit with Kentucky right now. He's from Lexington. Let's say that they land him and they decide they're going to pay him $500,000 directly from the university, but he signs an NIL deal with a local company for $4 million. and he's going to do a 30-minute autograph signing. Like, is that a reasonable amount of compensation for a 30-minute autograph signing? Probably not. But how are they going to determine that? If 6 other schools also pay a dude $4 million to do that, then what do you do? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's not like a reasonable range of compensation for something that hasn't really previously existed is incredibly vague and not at all. Like, again, like, and as you mentioned when we were talking offline, like the value that Tyron Stokes, who's from Lexington, might have versus, if you were to go to a different school, or what, like, there's just so many different factors that I have a really hard time. We joked earlier, like Jeremy Roach had an NIL deal with Raid because his last name is Roach. How do you determine the compensation package for that? Because he didn't do anything. His 3-point percentage at Duke or Baylor is irrelevant to this conversation because he just has a funny last name. Like, it's a very difficult thing to police and monitor, and I have no earthly idea how they're going to do it, considering the sheer volume of requests and specific things submit. I mean, it's going to be they're just going to get blasted by thousands of these things that I have no idea how they're going to determine it. I'm curious. I'm excited to see, but I don't know how.
I can see Bobby Moynihan's drunk uncle character on SNL being like, does your AI NIL deal have, just some kind of, I mean, it's so absurd, Andy. But, and like, is cost of living a factor, for example, right? Like where I live in Southwest Missouri is wildly cheaper than where you live up in the Pacific Northwest. And like, does that like, there's just so many factors. How can this thing accurately come into that? And as you said, is it enforceable, or will the College Sports Commission be equally as inept, as much of a laughing stock as the NCAA has been, right? Like, I hope, I'm hopeful. I'm with you. I'm hopeful, but I just, reasonable range of compensation is whatever somebody's willing to pay you. How does that hold up in court, right? Like, I for my Ford dealership, we believe that it is worth us paying $3 million to player X to sign autographs for an hour. How are you going to tell me it's not? I just, I don't know. But ultimately, Andy, I think what people more than anything want to see is, can this, please, dear goodness, end the pay for play nature of it all and be honest to goodness what NIL is intended to be? Because it is and should be a beautiful, helpful thing for student athletes, but it's the pay to play nature of it that warps it, in my opinion.
I literally thought of this off the cup, and I agree with everything you said. And you kind of took the last point I was going to make, which is great. But what I'm also going to say is, like, what about like the Players Era Festival? So, like, you get $1 million for participating in that event, right? The school can allocate that money. However, as far as I understand, they're not required to pay every player an equal amount of that money. So if Gonzaga wins the Players Era Festival because Graham Ike scores 40 points in 3 straight games, and then they decide to give all of that $1 million to Graham Ike, I don't know, they won't, but like, or they give him half of it and they split the rest. Like, does that have to go through NIL Go? Like, it's very confused. Like, there's just so many weird oddities about this that I have truly no idea. Ooh. And I'm not even opposed to this being written vaguely. I think that was the right thing. I'm not yet confident that the people who are going to have to like tighten this up and figure out the exact parameters, I'm not super confident in the people who are being asked to do that, because we don't really know who they are. This is a new company, this new thing. But if they get this right, I think it could be incredibly beneficial to the sport at large. If they don't get it right, it's just going to feel like it always has, where players are just getting paid. They're just circumventing the laws and paying them however much they want. And so it's not going to feel like worse. It's just going to kind of feel the same. But this could be really good. I'm just not sure how well it's going to actually work when they put it into practice.
One other quick thing I just thought of, and this might be in the language and I'm just forgetting about it. I need to go back and look at the CSC website. But who actually submits it, a third-party deal to that? Is it the third-party entity that wants to do it? Is it the player or the player's agent, or perhaps the school/athletic department?
It is the underpaid and overworked compliance officer at these schools. I can almost guarantee you, as somebody who used to work in that industry.
Right. But it's like, yeah, because that could there's a multitude of people that submission could come from. Anyway, that would be interesting to see as well.
Well, Isaac, the last kind of big pillar in this conversation with the settlement is the new roster limits. And frankly, the roster limits are being talked about a lot more in different sports, specifically in football, and they're not as relevant to basketball, but we still want to talk about them. We're also going to share some other final thoughts on this settlement. Again, one of many conversations we'll have about this here on Locked On College Basketball, and we're going to get to all that in just a second. All right, Isaac, closing out the show, closing out again, one of our multiple conversations we will have here about the House settlement as it came to fruition on Friday night. Another big kind of part of this whole conversation, and really honestly, the part that slowed down this might have been done a month ago or a couple of weeks ago, but roster limits were a big sticking point for both sides in terms of getting this thing fully done and finalized. And again, because basketball rosters are just much smaller by nature, the differences in these roster limits conversations is just not as significant in basketball. But Isaac, I know you read a really helpful article kind of about some of the different elements of this, and I'd love for you to kind of break down what is changing with the House settlement with regards to roster limits in college sports.
Great question, Andy. I want to shout out Christy Dosh, who writes about sports business for Forbes, has her own website and entity called Business of College Sports, and actually just put out a book called The Athletes NIL Playbook. Very helpful stuff. Andy, I think we should try to get Christy on. Her content is great. Like, I was nerdily enthralled by her writing. Anyway, one of the big parts of the settlement is the abolishment of scholarship limits, but the implementation of roster limits. And I think that's a big, those keywords, scholarship and roster, are the key there. Abolishment of scholarship limits, implementation of roster limits. But the key here is, as opposed to what we talked about with NIL, where it didn't matter whether you opted into to rev share, that applied to you. This only applies to schools who do opt into rev share. I think that's a key point here. But Andy, the reason this was such a sticking point, as you were mentioning, is because schools had preemptively started making roster cuts to get under these limits, because the limits had already kind of come out. Like, we've known for a while that college basketball, the plan was for it to be 15 scholarships as opposed to the previous 13, right? And so schools had started doing that to save money in, like, basically non-rev sports and football, because the football limit was going to come way down. And that's where the judge kept bumping back and saying, we got to make a plan for this. And so, Andy, what kind of is that plan and that provision that has come through with this?
Well, basically, I mean, any judge was seeing, like, okay, there are people who are being preemptively punished, losing scholarships, losing opportunities before we've even finalized this, which is obviously wrong. And so they basically determined those specific people should not be punished for this. Like, they did not want that to continue to happen. So the rule they came up with is they're calling them designated student athletes. And I'm just going to read a direct quote here. Any current college athletes cut from teams because of roster limits, in addition to any recruits with offers pulled, will be labeled DSAs and will, quote, not count against roster limits at their original institution or any institution where they transfer. They will remain DSAs for the remainder of their collegiate eligibility. So if you were, if you know, a certain team had 17 players on their roster and they, you know, had 13 scholarship guys, they had 4 walk-ons, they were up to 17, and the staff decided, hey, we need to get down to 15. We're going to offer these 2 guys scholarships to get to 15 scholarship players. These 2 guys, sorry, you're getting the boot. Those players would become designated student athletes, which means they would be able to go to other schools and not count against the roster limit at those other schools, or they could stay at their current institution and not count against the roster limit, is the way that I'm understanding it here. And so, again, for basketball, you're talking about most of the programs, this probably didn't even impact them at all. And the ones that did, it's maybe 1 or 2 players. For football, this was hundreds, thousands. I mean, there are football rosters that had like 10s, 20s more players on their roster as walk-ons than they actually were going to have room for. So it didn't really impact basketball all that dramatically, which is part of the reason that, like, we didn't talk about it all that much when this was happening. And even, like, it just hasn't been as big of a sticking point in this specific sport, but it is relevant in some degree. And it's also more relevant in football and certainly non-rev sports like baseball and others that are have bigger rosters as well. But it is something that'll be interesting, kind of just what the future of walk-ons ends up being, because really, if every player is on scholarship, they're not going to be walk-ons in the traditional sense. Right. But I think that you're still going to have those types of players. It's just going to, either we're going to have to give them a different name, or we're just going to have to accept that the language is changing a little bit.
Yes. I've been referring to them as scholarship level players and non-scholarship level players, which is clunky, but it works for me for right now, Andy. But like with what you're saying there, it's almost like, remember when COVID eligible players, the first year or two, they did not count against your roster limits.
Right,
And so we're getting that kind of thing again, where we might have some bloated rosters while these players are grandfathered in. Now, eventually that's going to die off, because same with COVID eligibility, it's not going to be an ongoing thing. It's just for players for right now, but it could create some odd roster situations here for the next couple of years, Andy. And so we're going to have to track that. But I think ultimately part of the reason this doesn't affect basketball as much is because in this transfer portal era, coaches already weren't really wanting to use more than 10, 11, 12 scholarship level players, because then guys at the end of the bench are frustrated and peace out, and then that's bad PR. And so now, since the roster size is 15, like, sure, maybe you want to get up to 15 because you need the bodies, but ultimately I think we will still see 10 to 12 scholarship level players, and then the rest of that roster filled out by traditional walk-ons who are just now getting scholarships. It just might not be in the same cool videos that we see where it's like, hey, call your mom, here you go, you know.
And again, and that's for the programs that have a lot of money. For smaller programs, they're, I mean, if they're opting into this, like they're going to get the minimum number that they want, and then they're going to be good like that. And so in that degree, like if you're trying to walk on to, like, let's say Dayton opts in and A10, and like they're a little bit more cash poor, like you may not be able to do that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so, and again, and I think that there's a larger conversation that we will have another time, as we were already over 30 minutes, but, and maybe not even us, because it's not as relevant to college basketball, but like, if you're hearing what we're saying here and you're thinking, well, this seems like it's going to be really bad for the non-football and basketball sports, you're probably right. It's not good. And like, I think that is a concern, a very legitimate concern. What does this mean for some of the non-power, even basketball programs as well? Like, I think there's some serious ramifications here that I'm hoping, we can find a way to work together to make it so it's not as dramatic. But this is going to hurt. This is going to hurt a lot. It's going to help in a lot of ways, but it's going to hurt in a lot of ways too. And I think we can get to unpack that in future episodes here, especially as this starts to come together and we start to get a little bit more information as to how this is all going to work. But Isaac, I think unless you got something else you want to add, I think that wraps up at least our inaugural conversation about this.
That's right. Inaugural. Very quick thing, Andy, and this will be something that we will learn probably next week once they release the list of schools that opt in to rev share. Is, you mentioned that, like Dayton and A10, will conferences go together on opting in, or will we see fracture within conferences? That'll be a really interesting thing to see. But again, that's for another episode once we see that list.
Let's call it there. Let's wrap it up. Fun conversation. I hope people got a lot out of this. I know it was a topic that is a little bit confusing and kind of stressful for some people. So I'm hoping we're able to kind of help answer some of the main questions. Obviously, if you have additional questions or concerns or things like that, feel free to reach out to us on social media. Let us know. We're happy to try to help as much as we can. There's some great resources out there. We can link some of those as well. But again, I think for a lot of folks, if you do have questions, so do a lot of people. Like, there's still a lot of unanswered questions that are out there. And I think we're going to get some more answers to those questions in due time. But for right now, this is a seismic change to this sport that we're going to continue to unpack here on Locked On College Basketball. But folks, that is going to wrap it up for us today. So thank you so much for listening, for making this show your first listen or watch of the day. We'll be back with some more basketball-specific topics in future episodes this week. But again, we always want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes, reference them a few times. Cheers to the Mick Bruins. And until Tuesday, peace out.